January 1st, 2025, Iran becomes a full BRICS member. And in that exact moment, 51% of the world's proven oil reserves fell under the control of a single economic bloc. Not influenced by, not traded with, controlled by. The largest energy consolidation since OPEC's formation in 1960. And almost nobody understands what just happened. Here's the number that should terrify you. In the last 18 months, $13.4 trillion in global trade has shifted away from dollar-based settlement systems. That's not a projection. That's already happened. And Iran's membership just accelerated a process that follows a pattern so precise, so mathematically predictable, that once you see it, every geopolitical move for the next decade becomes crystal clear. This pattern has destroyed empires, it's collapsed currencies, it's redrawn maps. And it's never, not even once, been stopped halfway through. We're currently in stage 3 of a 4-stage sequence. And stage 4 is inevitable. The mechanism doesn't care about military power. It doesn't care about political ideology. It doesn't care about who deserves to win. It simply executes. And right now, it's executing exactly on schedule. Let me show you the mechanism. Because understanding this pattern is the difference between seeing the future clearly and being blindsided by it. The difference between protecting your wealth and watching it evaporate. The difference between strategic positioning and catastrophic exposure. Every major power transition in history follows 4 identical stages. Stage 1, infrastructure building. A rising power identifies the structural weaknesses of the dominant system and begins constructing parallel alternatives, not through confrontation, through quiet, methodical creation of substitute frameworks. Think of it like building a second electrical grid while the first one still works. You don't announce it, you just build piece by piece. Until one day you flip a switch and an entire city can choose which grid to use. Stage 2, network effects and adoption. The alternative infrastructure reaches critical mass. Other nations begin using it not because they're forced to, but because it offers genuine advantages. Lower costs, better terms, more autonomy. This is when the parallel system becomes competitive, when early adopters become advocates, when the alternative stops being alternative and starts being viable. Stage 3, crisis recognition and response. The dominant power finally recognizes the threat. They respond with pressure, sanctions, military posturing, diplomatic isolation. But here's the critical detail that repeats every single time. By stage 3, the structural migration has already occurred. The users have already switched grids. The trade routes have already shifted. The response is psychologically satisfying but strategically meaningless, like trying to stop a flood after the dam is already broken. Stage 4, system rebalancing. The new architecture solidifies. The old arrangements either adapt radically or become secondary. Power doesn't transfer completely. It never does. It redistributes. And the world operates under fundamentally different rules. 4 stages. Mechanical precision. 0 deviations across centuries of history. Let me prove it with 3 examples. 1870 to 1914. German industrial rise and the end of British manufacturing dominance. For decades, Britain was the workshop of the world. In 1860, 60% of global manufactured exports came from British factories. Steam engines, railways, ships, textiles, machinery. If it was manufactured and exported, it was probably British. Their empire provided captive markets. Their navy protected trade routes. It seemed permanent. Stage 1, 1870 to 1895. Germany unified under Bismarck and immediately identified Britain's vulnerability. Britain's industrial advantage came from being first, not from systematic innovation. German leadership made a strategic decision. They would build a superior industrial base from scratch. They invested massively in technical education, established research universities focused on chemistry, metallurgy, and engineering, created the world's first PhD programs in applied sciences, built tight institutional partnerships between banks and industry. Banks didn't just lend money, they took equity stakes and sat on corporate boards. This allowed long-term investment in technology that British companies, focused on quarterly dividends, couldn't match. They constructed infrastructure specifically designed for the second industrial revolution. Electrical systems, chemical plants, steel mills using the latest Bessemer and open hearth processes. Stage 2, 1895 to 1910. German exports surged. By 1900, German steel production surpassed Britain's. Their chemical industry, particularly BASF and Bayer, dominated global dye production, pharmaceuticals, and industrial chemicals. 90% of the world's industrial dyes came from Germany by 1910. Their electrical engineering companies, Siemens and AEG, set world standards. Other nations began buying German machinery over British equivalents. Students from around the world studied engineering in German universities instead of British ones. The network effects kicked in. German methods became the global standard. Stage 3, 1910 to 1914. Britain recognized the threat. The naval arms race intensified. the Dreadnought-class battleships. Britain implemented tariff reforms in 1912, trying to protect domestic industry. They launched campaigns to buy British, to support domestic manufacturing, to resist German commercial penetration. German productivity per worker was 30% higher in key sectors. Their technology was a generation ahead. The response came too late to matter economically. Stage 4. World War I destroyed the old order entirely. But even before a shot was fired, the industrial balance had fundamentally changed. British factories were using increasingly outdated technology. German innovations in chemicals, steel, and electrical engineering had created structural advantages that peacetime competition couldn't overcome. After the war, despite Germany losing, despite reparations, Germany remained an industrial powerhouse. By 1925, they were producing more steel than Britain again. Britain never regained manufacturing dominance. Controlled Middle Eastern production through concession agreements negotiated when these nations were colonies or protectorates. They extracted profits while paying host nations minimal royalties. In 1950, Saudi Arabia received 50 cents per barrel, while companies sold that oil for $1.80. Stage 1, 1950 to 1960. Oil-producing nations began coordinating. Venezuela, under Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso, initiated conversations about collective action. They studied markets. They shared expertise. They built relationships. Iran nationalized its oil industry in 1951 under Mohammad Mossadegh. The nationalization failed. British intelligence and the CIA orchestrated a coup in 1953. Western control was restored, but the attempt signaled something critical. Attitudes were changing. Saudi Arabia negotiated 50-50 profit sharing in 1950. Not majority ownership, not control, just equal profit sharing. And even that was considered radical. But each small step built foundation. They were constructing alternative models of resource control. Stage 2, 1960 to 1973. OPEC formed in Baghdad in September 1960. 5 founding members: Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. Western media dismissed it as a talking shop, but membership grew. Libya, Indonesia, Algeria, Nigeria, Ecuador, Gabon followed through the 60s. They studied markets systematically, built technical expertise, trained economists and petroleum engineers. And critically, they waited. They waited for the moment when market conditions gave them leverage. By 1970, they had mechanisms for coordinated action. By 1973, they had leverage because global spare production capacity had disappeared. Stage 3, October 1973. The Yom Kippur War provided the catalyst. OPEC announced production cuts supporting Arab nations. 5 million barrels per day removed from global markets. Oil prices quadrupled, from $3 per barrel to $12 in 6 months. Western nations responded with outrage. Emergency meetings. The International Energy Agency was created specifically to counter OPEC. Strategic petroleum reserves were established. Henry Kissinger openly discussed seizing oil fields militarily. A Pentagon study concluded it was technically feasible, but the structural change had already occurred. The producing nations physically controlled the resource. They had the technical expertise to operate fields independently. No amount of military threat could change the fundamental geography that oil was under their territory. Stage 4, the rebalancing. OPEC didn't control all oil. North Sea production came online. Alaska, Mexico. But OPEC controlled enough to set floor prices. Western oil companies went from owners to service providers. They still made money. But the relationship had fundamentally changed. Petrodollars flowed to producing nations instead of consuming nations. Hundreds of billions annually. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE became major financial players. The entire global financial system reorganized around this new reality. Energy power had permanently shifted. 2000 to 2024. China, manufacturing, and supply chain migration. At the turn of the millennium, the United States and Europe dominated high-value manufacturing. Complex electronics, pharmaceuticals, precision machinery, aerospace. Automotive China was the cheap labor source for low-end goods. Toys, textiles, basic assembly. Their wages were a fraction of Western levels. Their technology was decades behind, but their leadership understood something Western executives missed. Manufacturing expertise is transferable, and whoever controls manufacturing capacity eventually controls innovation. Stage 1, 2000 to 2008. China didn't just accept low-end status. They built systematically toward technological independence. Infrastructure investment was staggering. Ports expanded to handle the largest container ships. Power grids were built to industrial specifications. High-speed rail-connected manufacturing centers. Industrial parks were created with integrated utilities, transportation, and regulatory support. Education was revolutionized. In 2000, China graduated 300,000 engineers annually. By 2008, 600,000. They required technology transfer for market access. If you wanted to sell to China's 1.3 billion consumers, you manufactured in China. And if you manufactured in China, you transferred technology through joint ventures. They invested profits into climbing the value chain, not consuming. Industrial capacity, research and development, advanced manufacturing equipment, Stage 2, 2008 to 2018. The global financial crisis accelerated everything. While Western companies cut capital expenditure, China expanded. Their manufacturing became sophisticated, not just assembly, design, process innovation, material science. Supply chains deepened to unprecedented levels. In Shenzhen, when you needed a specific electronic component, you had 10 suppliers within 50 kilometers. Lead times dropped from weeks to days. Costs dropped despite rising wages because efficiency improved faster than labor costs rose. Quality rose. Apple didn't manufacture iPhones in China because labor was cheap by 2015. Chinese factory wages had increased tenfold. They manufactured there because the entire ecosystem existed nowhere else. The engineers, the suppliers, the logistics, the expertise. Stage 3, 2018 to 2024. The United States recognized the threat. The China trade war, tariffs on $360 billion in goods, export controls on semiconductors, manufacturing equipment, advanced software, reshoring initiatives with massive subsidies, $52 billion for domestic chip production through the CHIPS Act, friendshoring to move supply chains to allied nations, political pressure on companies to leave China. But the supply chains had already migrated. The expertise had already transferred. You can't rebuild decades of integrated manufacturing infrastructure in 5 years with subsidies. The ecosystem takes time. They went from technology recipient to technology leader in renewable energy and electric vehicles. Stage 1, infrastructure building, 2003 to 2015. After the Iraq invasion, Iran faced existential pressure. 2006, they helped create the Asian Clearing Union with India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Myanmar, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, a mechanism for settling regional trade in local currencies instead of dollars. 2008, they began accepting non-dollar payment for oil exports. Yuan from China, rupees from India, even barter arrangements, Turkish goods for Iranian oil, grain from Russia for Iranian products. Each agreement chipped away at dollar dependency. 2012, cut off from SWIFT, the Western-dominated international payment system, they developed CPAM, their domestic interbank transfer system, connected Iranian banks, allowed internal commerce to function. Then they connected it to Russian payment systems, small steps, but each step reduced Western leverage. 2014, strategic discussions with China intensified, not just buying oil, comprehensive partnership, infrastructure, technology, long-term energy supply agreements. 2015, while negotiating the nuclear deal with Western powers, they simultaneously deepened military cooperation with Russia in Syria, sharing intelligence, coordinating operations, building institutional relationships. Every piece was foundation. Every step created alternatives to Western-controlled systems. Notice the timeline, 12 years of methodical construction before most analysts even recognized a pattern. Check. Stage 1 complete. Stage 2, network effects and adoption, 2015 to 2023. The infrastructure reached critical mass and others took notice. The alternative systems weren't just Iranian anymore. They became regional, then international. 2016, India developed the rupee-rial trade mechanism to bypass sanctions and continue buying Iranian oil. Not because India loved Iran, because the mechanism worked, saved money, and provided energy security. Bilateral trade jumped. 2018, Turkey, facing its own tensions with the West, expanded lira-real trade. 2019, Instex, created by France, Germany, and Britain. A special purpose vehicle to facilitate Iran trade despite U.S. sanctions. It barely functioned due to American political pressure. European banks were too afraid of secondary sanctions, but its existence proved something critical. Even European allies recognized the need for dollar alternatives. 2021, the China Strategic Partnership officially signed. 25 years. $400 billion in committed investment. But more important than the dollar amount was the framework. Technology transfer in telecommunications, ports, railways, joint development of oil and gas fields, Chinese investment in Iranian infrastructure, energy supply guarantees for China. A complete bilateral system operating parallel to Western structures. 2022, Iran formally applies for BRICS membership. 2023, full membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization approved. Each edition brought network effects. China trades with Iran in yuan, reducing dollar usage for both nations. Russia coordinates energy policy with Iran, giving both leverage over European markets. India uses the alternate payment systems developed for Iranian trade to also trade with Russia under sanctions. The mechanisms built for sanctions evasion became useful for voluntary de-dollarization. Venezuela, under heavy sanctions, adopted similar payment systems. Syria explored them. Iraq quietly studied them. Even Saudi Arabia, America's closest Arab ally, sent delegations to study BRICS mechanisms. The alternative infrastructure became attractive not just to sanctioned nations, but to anyone seeking autonomy, from insurance against Western sanctions, from freedom to make independent foreign policy decisions without financial punishment. Verified. Stage 2, showing identical network dynamics to historical patterns. Stage 3, crisis recognition and response, 2023 to present. Sanctions expanded. Secondary sanctions on entities trading with Iran. Naval presence increased in the Persian Gulf. Diplomatic pressure intensified on nations considering BRICS membership. Iran labeled the primary destabilizing force. BRICS characterized as an anti-Western coalition. But consider the current situation mathematically. Iran is integrated into an economic bloc representing 46% of global population, 32% of global GDP, over 50% of oil reserves with Iran included, 40% of natural gas reserves. You can sanction Iran individually, but can you simultaneously sanction China, Russia, India, Brazil, and South Africa? The world's largest manufacturer, a nuclear power and energy supplier, the world's most populous nation, the agricultural superpower? No, the economic cost would be catastrophic. Military posturing faces the same limitation. Pre-BRICS, Iran was isolated. Post-BRICS, they have major power backing. Economic retaliation becomes possible. China could dump treasury bonds. Russia could cut energy to Europe. The cost-benefit calculation has fundamentally shifted. More importantly, what would military action achieve strategically? You can't bomb away economic integration. You can't airstrike alternative payment systems. Military force is irrelevant to structural economic transitions. This is exactly what happened in every historical example. Britain couldn't bomb German universities. The US couldn't invade OPEC nations. You can't tariff away supply chains once they've physically migrated. The Stage 3 response is always militarily possible, but strategically pointless, because structural changes don't reverse through pressure. Now we reach Stage 4, the inevitable rebalancing. The pattern tells us exactly what it will look like. The Middle East power structure will reorganize around 3 new realities. First, energy sales will increasingly settle in non-dollar currencies. China buys Saudi oil in yuan. Russia and Iran trade in rubles and rials. India uses rupees. The dollar won't disappear. It will lose monopoly status. And monopoly status provided the US its primary structural leverage, the ability to run unlimited deficits because global oil trade created automatic dollar demand, the ability to sanction effectively. All of that requires monopoly, and monopoly is ending. Second, regional security arrangements will become genuinely multipolar. Gulf states are hedging. Saudi Arabia joining BRICS, purchasing Chinese drones and missiles, UAE balancing relationships, hosting Russian and Chinese military exercises. They're creating options, multiple security partners, multiple weapons suppliers. Nations with options have leverage. Nations without options have dependence. American influence becomes negotiated rather than assumed. Third, economic development funding will diversify completely. 2027 to 2030, the first major stress test. Likely a U.S. fiscal crisis forcing recognition of dollar constraints, a failed treasury auction, a debt ceiling disaster, rising interest rates that crush growth while failing to prevent inflation. This is when the structural changes become undeniable. 2030 to 2035, institutional rebalancing. The IMF and World Bank either undergo radical reform or become increasingly irrelevant. New institutions handle the majority of infrastructure financing for the developing world. That's the trajectory. The specific triggering events will vary. The timing might shift by a year or two. But the sequence is locked in. Stage 4 follows Stage 3, always, without exception. Now let me address every objection you're thinking. Objection 1, American military power is too overwhelming. Response, the United States spends $800 billion annually on defense, unmatched capability. But power is only meaningful if it achieves strategic objectives. What's the objective? Prevent Iran from trading with China? You'd need to blockade China's ports, economic suicide, stop BRICS expansion, intimidate 46% of global population, including nuclear powers. Not feasible. Military power cannot solve structural economic transitions. Britain had the world's most powerful navy in 1900, didn't stop the dollar's rise. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons, didn't stop economic collapse. Military might is irrelevant to economic architecture. Objection 2, dollar entrenchment is too deep. Response, the dollar is currently 60% of global reserves, but in 2000, it was 71%. The trend is clear and accelerating. Reserve status is a lagging indicator. The British pound was 65% of global reserves in 1914, 10% by 1975. Transitions happen. They're historically normal. Objection 3, technology advantages are insurmountable. Response, technology requires resource inputs, rare earths for electronics, 90% controlled by China, lithium for batteries, majority in BRICS nations, cobalt, copper, oil. Gas, majority BRICS. Technology without resources is theoretical. Resources plus adequate technology beats superior technology without resources. Every single time. Let me be specific about what this means for you personally. If you're an investor, dollar-denominated long-term bonds are structurally challenged. As dollar monopoly declines, the U.S. cannot export inflation as effectively. Inflation stays domestic. Real returns on 30-year Treasury bonds will be negative more often than positive. Diversification across currencies becomes essential, not speculation. Risk management, hold dollar assets for dollar-denominated liabilities. Hold yuan exposure for exposure to Chinese growth and BRICS trade. Hold gold as non-sovereign store of value. Hold commodity-linked currencies like the Australian dollar or Norwegian krone. The specific percentages are debatable. The need for diversification absolutely is not. Equity markets face bifurcation. Companies with global supply chains accessing both Western and BRICS systems will thrive. Apple, Tesla, Caterpillar. Companies locked into single systems face disruption. If your revenue is purely domestic dollar denominated and your supply chain is purely Chinese, you have currency mismatch risk and geopolitical risk. If your entire market is American consumers and you can't shift, you face declining purchasing power as inflation rises. Commodity producers will see sustained higher prices as BRICS nations industrialize and demand increases, while the dollar's purchasing power for commodities decreases. Real estate depends entirely on location. Properties in gateway cities with international capital flows could maintain value. New York, San Francisco, Miami, Los Angeles. International buyers provide demand. But secondary markets dependent purely on domestic buyers and domestic financing face pressure. If mortgage rates stay elevated because inflation stays elevated because the U.S. can't export it anymore, housing affordability collapses, demand falls, prices adjust. If you're a business owner, supply chain resilience requires access to both Western and BRICS manufacturing ecosystems. Companies that can source from China and Vietnam and Mexico and the U.S. will handle disruptions. Companies dependent on single sources will face shortages, price spikes, and political risks. This isn't about politics. It's about redundancy. When systems fragment, you need access to multiple fragments. Build relationships now. Diversify suppliers now, before the crisis forces it and prices spike. Currency risk management becomes critical. If you invoice in dollars but pay costs in yuan, you have mismatch exposure. Hedge it. If you receive payments in multiple currencies, maintain banking relationships in those currencies. Don't convert everything to dollars immediately. Hold working capital in the currencies where you have expenses. If you're an employee, develop skills that translate across systems. Language skills become more valuable. Mandarin, Arabic, Russian, not just for personal use, for professional opportunity. Companies operating globally will pay premiums for employees who can navigate both Western and BRICS business cultures. Technical skills that aren't system dependent remain valuable. Engineering, programming, data analysis, these work anywhere. Skills that are purely system dependent become risky. Regulatory expertise in U.S. have only frameworks. Legal specialization in dollar system contracts, still valuable, but less universally marketable. Believes this time is different because once the transition becomes obvious, once stage 4 is undeniable, the repositioning opportunity is gone. Here's your action framework. Immediate actions in the next 3 months. Assess currency exposure. If 100% of assets are dollar denominated, you are concentrated in a declining monopoly. Begin diversification. 5 to 10% gold, 5 to 10% exposure to emerging market currencies or commodity currencies. This isn't betting against America. This is risk management. Evaluate supply chain dependencies. If you're in business, map where critical inputs come from. Identify alternatives. Begin relationship building with suppliers in different jurisdictions. Build skills. Identify what language or technical competency would most increase your professional optionability. Begin learning, even basic competency signals. Adaptability to employers. Actions in the next 12 months. Watch for the stage 4 trigger event. It will probably manifest as a dollar crisis. Failed treasury auction, debt ceiling disaster, inflation spike that forces Fed into impossible choice between defending currency and preventing recession. When it happens, don't panic. Recognize it as the expected transition point. Adjust positioning if you haven't already. Increase international exposure. Reduce long-duration dollar bonds. Increase commodity exposure. Evaluate real estate holdings. If you're in secondary markets with purely domestic demand, Consider whether to hold or shift to markets with international capital flows. Build relationships and networks that span systems. Join trade organizations that include BRICS members. Attend international conferences. Build a professional network that isn't purely domestic. These relationships become valuable when systems fragment. They provide information, opportunities, resilience, long-term strategic positioning. Understand that this transition creates enormous opportunities for those positioned correctly. The companies that dominated internet commerce weren't the established retailers who slowly added websites. They were Amazon and Alibaba, who understood both physical and digital commerce from the start. Same principle here. The individuals and organizations that can fluently operate in both Western and BRICS frameworks will extract enormous value. That's not predicting winners and losers based on ideology. That's understanding that transition periods advantage the flexible over the rigid, the adaptable over the committed, the diversified over the concentrated. Iran's BRICS membership on January 1st, 2025, is the signal that Stage 3 has matured and Stage 4 is imminent. The foundation was built over 20 years. The network effects occurred. The crisis recognition happened. Now comes the rebalancing. And historical patterns tell us with absolute certainty that nothing stops Stage 4. The pattern completes because it's structural, not political, based on resource control, network effects, and economic gravity. The Middle East will show this transition first and most visibly, because energy resources are geographically concentrated there, because competing American and BRICS interests collide there most directly, because the symbolic and strategic importance makes it the obvious arena. Watch carefully over the next 36 months. Watch which nations accept which currencies for oil sales. Watch where infrastructure investment funding comes from, World Bank or BRICS Development Bank. Watch voting patterns in the UN and other international institutions. Every choice reveals alignment. Every alignment reveals the emerging structure. You now have knowledge most people won't gain for another 5 years minimum. You understand the pattern. You understand the 4-stage mechanism. You understand where this inevitably goes. The only question remaining is what you do with that understanding. Because knowledge without action is entertainment. And this is far too important to be mere entertainment. This is your financial future, your professional trajectory, your strategic positioning in a fundamentally reorganizing world. The pattern is clear. The mechanism is understood. The timeline is predictable. The outcome is mathematically inevitable. Stage 4 is coming. And when it arrives, when the rebalancing completes, the world will operate under completely different rules. Your singular job is to be positioned before that transition becomes obvious to everyone. Because by the time it's obvious, by the time it's in mainstream headlines, by the time your neighbors are discussing it, the positioning opportunity has already closed. That's how pattern transitions work. They're invisible to most people until they're undeniable. And by the time they're undeniable, it's too late to prepare optimally. Watch the pattern unfold. It will happen exactly as described, with the precision of clockwork. Because it always does. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes with perfect meter, and right now it's rhyming with every major power transition we've documented. The Ottoman decline as European sea routes opened. The pound's fall as the dollar rose. OPEC's emergence ending Western energy control. China's supply chain dominance ending Western manufacturing supremacy. Same pattern, same stages, same inevitable outcome. The only variable is whether you recognize it in time to position accordingly, or whether you will be among those in 2035, wondering how the world changed so completely while they weren't paying attention. Iran joining BRICS isn't just another news story. Iran joining BRICS is the symptom that confirms the diagnosis. The diagnosis is complete restructuring of global power along lines that have been developing for 25 years and are now reaching critical phase. The emergence of alternative systems functioning independently of Western control. The mathematical inevitability of rebalancing when one power overextends and alternatives successfully develop. This analysis isn't prediction, it's pattern recognition. And the pattern has never failed. Not once, not ever, not across centuries, not across continents, not across different resources or political systems. The foundation gets built, the expansion occurs, the crisis point arrives, the rebalancing happens. That's not opinion, that's documented historical sequence. And sequences that have repeated with perfect consistency throughout recorded history don't suddenly stop because we wish they would, or because we find them inconvenient, or because they challenge our assumptions about permanent American dominance. The future is knowable when you understand patterns. You now understand this one. Use that knowledge, position accordingly, and prepare for the world that's coming rather than clinging to the world that's ending.